It was 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Frank Malone had been sitting in the same rental car for 6 days straight. The coffee in his cup holder had gone cold an hour ago. His camera sat on the passenger seat, lens cap off, already aimed at the entrance of the Callaway Group office building across the street. He'd photographed that entrance so many times over the past week that he could describe every crack in the concrete steps, every scratch on the revolving door, the way the security guard always leaned slightly to the left when he checked badges. Frank knew this building the way you only know a place when you've had nothing to do but stare at it for hours on end. He also knew, by this point, exactly what time Daniel Mercer arrived each morning. It was always between 9:05 and 9:20. Never earlier, rarely later. Daniel was a creature of habit, which, in Frank's experience, was the one thing that always made his job easier. Creatures of habit were predictable. And predictable people, no matter how careful they thought they were being, always left a trail. Always. But on this particular Tuesday morning, 9:20 came and went. Then 9:30. Then 9:45. Frank sat up a little straighter in his seat and reached for his camera. He scanned the parking lot slowly, methodically, the way he'd been trained to do back when he was still on the force. Daniel's car, a silver Audi A4, plates he'd long since memorized, was not there. He had not driven past the entrance. He had not parked on the street. Frank pulled out his phone and checked the photos he'd taken that morning of Daniel leaving his home on Westbrook Drive. 8:14 a.m., right on schedule. Briefcase in hand. Kiss on the cheek for his wife at the door. Then into the car and gone. He had left home. He had just never arrived at work. And that was the moment Frank Malone knew, with the particular quiet certainty that only comes from 29 years of doing this job, that what he was dealing with was not what his client had hired him to find. She had hired him because she thought her husband was having an affair. Frank had been prepared to find an affair. He had found those before, more times than he cared to count, and there was a rhythm to it, the same kinds of locations, the same kinds of excuses, the same look on his clients' faces when he laid the photographs on the table. He knew that rhythm by heart. This was not that rhythm. This was something else entirely. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we talk about what Frank found, you need to understand the woman who hired him. You need to understand Sarah. Because this story, at its core, is not really about a detective or a cheating husband or even the unbelievable truth that eventually came out. It's about a woman who was living a life she thought was real, in a marriage she thought was hers, with a man she thought she knew completely. And the terrifying, gut-hollowing thing about Sarah's story is not that she was fooled. It's how thoroughly, and for how long, and how carefully she had been kept in the dark. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, the suspicious, and the truly jaw-dropping delivered in story format, then you have absolutely come to the right place, because that is all we do here, and we upload 2, 3, sometimes even 4 new stories every single week. So if that sounds like something you're into, go ahead and very quietly move your neighbor's garden gnome 3 inches to the left every single day until they start to think their yard is haunted. Also, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay. Now let's get into it. Sarah Mercer was 32 years old, a graphic designer who worked from home, and by every reasonable measure, she was living a good life. Not a flashy life. Not the kind of life that gets photographed for magazine spreads. But good, solid, and genuinely happy, or at least that is what she believed on the morning of March 4th, a Monday, when she stood at the front door of their house on Westbrook Drive and watched her husband Daniel back the silver Audi out of the driveway. He rolled down the window before he pulled into the street. He always did this. "Don't wait up if the Peterson account runs long," he said. She smiled and told him she wouldn't. She stood there until the car disappeared around the corner. Then she went inside, poured herself a second cup of coffee, sat down at her desk, and opened her laptop. She had 3 client briefs due by Friday and a quiet house to work in and absolutely no reason in the world to feel anything other than settled. She felt settled. That was the thing about Sarah that you have to understand before any of the rest of this makes sense. She was not a suspicious person. She was not someone who checked phones or questioned explanations or lay awake at night running through worst-case scenarios. That was simply not who she was. She trusted people the way some people trust the weather forecast, not blindly, not naively, but with a reasonable, grounded faith that the information she was being given reflected reality. Daniel had been her reality for 4 years. And in 4 years, he had never given her a single concrete reason to doubt him. Not once. And so she didn't. Daniel Mercer was 35, a regional sales manager, or so Sarah understood, for a mid-sized logistics firm based downtown. He left the house every weekday at 8:15 a.m. He came home between 6 and 7 in the evening, sometimes later when work ran long. He was attentive without being overbearing. He remembered things, her coffee order, the name of the difficult client she'd complained about twice in passing, the fact that she hated when the TV volume was set to an odd number. He was the kind of husband who made you feel seen in small ways. And those small ways, Sarah had always believed, were what actually held a marriage together. They had been together for 5 years and married for 4. They had bought the house on Westbrook Drive 8 months ago, stretching their budget to do it, agreeing that it was the right investment even if the timing was a little tight. Sarah had spent 3 weekends painting the guest bedroom herself because hiring someone felt wasteful. She had planted tomatoes in the back garden in September that hadn't taken, but she planned to try again in the spring. She had, in other words, built a life in this house. A real one, with tomato plants and painted walls and weekend grocery lists and a husband who remembered how she took her coffee. And on the morning of March 4th, 8 weeks pregnant with a child she hadn't yet told Daniel about, she had no idea that any of it was a lie. The first sign came on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks before Sarah ever thought to question anything. She was doing laundry, the ordinary, mindless kind of task that leaves your hands busy and your brain wandering, when she reached into the pocket of Daniel's gray blazer and pulled out a small folded receipt. She almost threw it away without looking at it. She nearly did. But something made her unfold it, the way you sometimes read a cereal box simply because it's in front of you and your mind needs something to land on. It was a parking receipt. Timestamped 11:22 a.m. The location printed at the top read Elmwood Shopping Center, a mid-size mall on the western edge of the city, roughly 40 minutes from Daniel's office. She stood there in the laundry room holding the receipt for a moment, not because it alarmed her, but because it mildly puzzled her. Daniel had never mentioned stopping at Elmwood. It wasn't on the way to anything he regularly went to. But then again, people ran errands. People grabbed lunch in unfamiliar places. People did ordinary things they didn't think to mention to their spouses because those things were simply too small and too unremarkable to bother reporting. Sarah folded the receipt back up, dropped it in the trash, and forgot about it. Or she tried to forget about it. The truth was, the receipt stayed somewhere in the back of her mind the way small unexplained things sometimes do, not loud enough to demand attention, but present enough that you're aware of it when the room goes quiet. She didn't take it out and examine it again. She didn't search for more receipts. She just washed the blazer, hung it up, and went about her week. 2 weeks later, she noticed the phone. It wasn't dramatic. Daniel didn't suddenly become secretive or jumpy or defensive the way people do in films when they're hiding something. It was far subtler than that, which in many ways made it harder to name. He simply began placing his phone face down on the table when he got home. Not always. Not in an obvious, deliberate way. But often enough that Sarah registered it without consciously deciding to. She noticed it the way you notice a picture that's been moved a centimeter on a wall. You can't immediately say what's different, but something is, and your brain keeps returning to the spot. She said nothing. What would she have said? You've been putting your phone face down and I find that strange. It sounded ridiculous even in her own head. People were entitled to their phones. She was not the kind of wife who policed that. So she said nothing and she watched and she told herself she was being the kind of paranoid that pregnancy books warned you about, that heightened anxiety was hormonal, that the mind in the first trimester has a tendency to manufacture threats where none exist. She told herself that. She believed it, mostly. Then came the overtime. It started on a Tuesday in late February, Daniel texting to say the Peterson account was giving them grief and he'd be late. Sarah made dinner for one and kept a plate warm. He came home at 9:15, kissed her on the head, ate standing at the counter, and went to bed tired. She didn't think anything of it. The following week it happened again. Then a third time. And by the fourth week, when Daniel texted on a Wednesday afternoon to say the Peterson account was running long again, Sarah found herself doing something she had never done before in 4 years of marriage. She opened her laptop and she typed the words into the search bar. Peterson account. Callaway Group. Regional clients. She wasn't sure exactly what she expected to find. Maybe a mention on a company blog. Maybe a LinkedIn reference to a major client partnership. Maybe nothing at all, which would have told her that corporate client names simply weren't the kind of thing that turned up in internet searches, and she could close the laptop and feel foolish and move on. But she searched, and she looked through everything that came back, and there was no Peterson account associated with Daniel's firm. No Peterson client. No Peterson anything in any context that connected to the logistics company Daniel worked for. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she closed the laptop. There was an explanation. There was obviously an explanation. A client account didn't need to have an internet footprint. A corporate partnership between a mid-sized logistics firm and someone named Peterson wasn't the kind of thing that generated search results. She knew that. She was being irrational. She was 12 weeks pregnant and her hormones were doing what hormones did, and she was turning a parking receipt and a face-down phone and a missing search result into a narrative that almost certainly did not exist. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window and watched the street outside and breathed. 3 days later, Daniel came home with flowers. It wasn't her birthday. It wasn't their anniversary. It wasn't any occasion she could identify. He walked through the front door on a Thursday evening with a bunch of pale pink peonies wrapped in brown paper and handed them to her with a smile that was easy and warm and entirely like him. She was touched. Genuinely touched. She put them in a vase on the kitchen table and thought that she had been unfair to him in her own mind, that she had been building a case against a man who bought her flowers for no reason other than that he felt like it. But later that evening, after dinner, she picked up the wrapping paper to throw it away and noticed the small sticker on the inside of the brown paper. It was from a florist called Petal and Stem. She didn't know any florist by that name. She looked it up quickly on her phone and found it immediately. Petal and Stem. A small independent flower shop on Garland Avenue. On the western side of the city. 40 minutes from Daniel's office. The same side of the city as the Elmwood Shopping Center on that parking receipt from 3 weeks ago. She set her phone down on the counter very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to feel slightly unsteady. She stood in the kitchen for a while. Daniel was in the other room watching television. She could hear the sound of it, familiar and ordinary, the background noise of every evening in this house. She looked at the peonies in the vase on the table. They were beautiful. They were genuinely beautiful. And she hated, in that moment, that she could not simply look at them and feel what she had felt an hour ago when he first handed them to her, before she'd seen the sticker, before the western side of the city had announced itself again in her mind like a door that kept swinging open no matter how many times she tried to shut it. She called her sister Anna that night after Daniel had gone to sleep. She told her everything. The receipt. The phone. The Peterson account that didn't exist online. The flowers from a florist 40 minutes from his office. She said it all out loud for the first time and heard how it sounded when it left her mouth and felt her stomach drop a little, because hearing it out loud was different from carrying it quietly in the back of your mind. Out loud, it had a shape. Out loud, it pointed somewhere. Anna listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said 4 words. Sarah. Hire someone. Now. Sarah didn't answer right away. She sat with the phone pressed to her ear in the dark of the hallway outside their bedroom, listening to Daniel breathe steadily on the other side of the door, and she thought about what it would mean to hire someone. What it would mean to make this real. Because as long as she hadn't done that, as long as it was just receipts and search results and the nagging unease of a pregnant woman lying awake at night, it could still be nothing. It could still be the story she'd been telling herself, that she was paranoid, that he was innocent, that the flowers were just flowers. The moment she hired someone, it became a question she was actually trying to answer. And she was terrified of the answer. But she picked up her laptop the following morning, and she started searching for private investigators in the city. And 3 days later, on a gray Thursday afternoon, she walked up a narrow staircase above a dry cleaner on Morrison Street and knocked on a door with a frosted glass panel that read simply, F. Malone, Investigations. Frank Malone did not look like what Sarah had imagined. She wasn't sure exactly what she had imagined, something from television, probably, some version of a private investigator that came with a leather jacket and a rehearsed cool. What she got instead was a man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a coffee-stained desk covered in manila folders, and the kind of face that had clearly spent several decades watching people lie to each other and had made a kind of peace with that fact. His office smelled like old paper and the faint chemical drift of the dry cleaner 2 floors below. There was a single window behind his desk with a view of a brick wall. It was not a glamorous operation. But the moment Frank Malone looked up from his desk and gestured for her to sit down, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt calm. Not the forced, brittle calm of someone talking themselves down from a ledge, but the genuine, solid calm of sitting across from someone who had seen worse than this and survived it professionally. There was something steadying about that. Something that made the panic she'd been carrying for 2 weeks settle slightly in her chest, like sediment after water stops moving. Frank let her talk without interrupting. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He didn't jump in, didn't finish her sentences, didn't nod along with the practiced sympathy of someone performing attentiveness. He simply listened. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and he wrote things down occasionally, but mostly he just watched her with calm, patient eyes while she laid out everything. The receipt. The phone. The Peterson account. The florist on Garland Avenue. The overtime that had been accumulating for weeks. She told him all of it in order, the way she'd rehearsed it on the drive over, and when she was done she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Frank looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked at her. Before I take this on, he said, I need you to understand something. I don't confirm suspicions. I find facts. And sometimes the facts are worse than what you came in here imagining. You need to be genuinely ready for that, because in my experience, most people think they're ready and they're not. Sarah told him she understood. He studied her for another moment, the way someone does when they're deciding whether the thing a person just said is true or just something they said. Then he nodded once, picked up his pen, and asked her for Daniel's full name, his employer, his vehicle registration, and his daily schedule. She gave him everything. She had written it all down beforehand on a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket, which she smoothed out on the desk in front of him. Frank looked at it, copied what he needed onto his legal pad, and slid the paper back to her. She paid the retainer in cash. It was money she'd been keeping in a separate account, one she'd opened quietly 8 months ago, just after they'd bought the house, telling herself it was a sensible thing to do, that every woman should have her own financial cushion, that it had nothing to do with distrust and everything to do with practicality. She had been saving it for the baby's nursery. Now she counted it out on Frank Malone's coffee-stained desk, and he folded it into an envelope without counting it back, and that was that. She walked back down the narrow staircase and out onto Morrison Street and sat in her car for a few minutes before she could bring herself to start the engine. She had made it real. There was no making it unreal now. Frank began the following Monday. His method was straightforward and unglamorous, which was exactly why it worked. He parked on Westbrook Drive at 7:50 a.m., close enough to observe the house without being visible from the front windows, and he waited. At 8:14 a.m., Daniel Mercer emerged from the front door in a charcoal suit, briefcase in hand, and kissed his wife goodbye at the door. Frank photographed him. He photographed the kiss. He photographed the Audi backing out of the driveway and turning south onto Westbrook Drive. Then he followed at a careful, practiced distance, not too close to be noticed, not far enough to lose him at a light. Daniel drove in the direction of downtown. Frank followed. For the first 15 minutes, the route was entirely consistent with a man driving to the Callaway Group offices, the right roads, the right general direction, no unexpected turns. And then, 3 blocks before the office building, Daniel's left indicator came on. He turned left. Frank noted the time, 8:31 a.m. He followed the Audi left, maintaining distance, watching it navigate through a series of streets that carried them steadily away from downtown and toward the western side of the city. Frank had been doing this job for 29 years, and he had a rule he developed somewhere around year 5, never decide what you're looking at until you've finished looking. People turned left for all kinds of reasons. A wrong turn. A coffee stop. A pharmacy. He didn't let himself think about what this meant. He just followed, and he noted, and he photographed. 38 minutes later, Daniel pulled into a quiet residential street called Archer Court and parked in front of a 4-story brick apartment building. Frank pulled over half a block back. He picked up his camera. Daniel got out of the Audi, straightened his jacket, and walked to the building's entrance without looking around. He pressed a buzzer. Waited approximately 12 seconds. Then the door opened and he went inside. Frank noted the time, 9:09 a.m. He noted the building address, 14B, Archer Court. He photographed the entrance. He photographed Daniel going through the door. Then he settled back in his seat and he waited, because waiting was the majority of this job and he had made his peace with that a long time ago. Daniel emerged at 11:03 a.m. He was still in the charcoal suit. He walked back to the Audi with the same unhurried ease with which he'd arrived, got in, and drove to a diner called Harlow's on the edge of the commercial district. Frank followed. Daniel ate alone at a window table, eggs, toast, coffee, and made 2 phone calls during the meal, both brief. Then he drove to the Callaway Group office building and parked in the lot at 11:47 a.m. Frank sat across the street and photographed the Audi pulling into the space. He wrote in his notes that evening, Day 1. Subject deviated from expected route at 8:31 a.m., 3 blocks prior to stated workplace. Drove to 14B, Archer Court, residential building, Western District. Spent approximately 114 minutes inside. No visual on contact. Subject subsequently attended workplace, arriving 11:47 a.m. No further anomalies. Returning tomorrow. Tuesday was the same. Same left turn at the same junction. Same building on Archer Court. This time Frank had repositioned himself earlier and had a clearer sight line to the building entrance. At 8:43 a.m., just before Daniel reached the door, it opened from the inside. A woman stepped into the doorway. She appeared to be in her early 30s. Dark hair, wearing a light blue cardigan. She held the door open for Daniel with the easy, automatic familiarity of someone who has opened a door for the same person hundreds of times. They didn't embrace in the doorway. They didn't kiss. But the body language between them, the proximity, the absence of any awkwardness, the way neither of them looked at the other with the charged, careful awareness that defines new intimacy, spoke of something long established. Something comfortable. Something domestic. Frank photographed them both. Wednesday, Daniel went straight to the office. Frank went to Archer Court anyway and waited. At 9:15 a.m., the woman in the blue cardigan left the building carrying a laptop bag and a travel coffee cup. She walked to a white Honda Civic parked on the street, got in, and drove away. Frank followed her to a co-working space on Fielding Street, where she badged herself in and disappeared inside. He photographed the building. He photographed her car. He ran the plates that afternoon. The vehicle was registered to a woman named Claire Hendricks. He ran the name through every database available to him. He found her social media profiles, sparse, mostly private. He found a professional profile listing her as a freelance marketing consultant. And then he ran the address at 14B, Archer Court, and found the lease records. The apartment was registered in the name of Claire Hendricks. It had been registered in her name for 3 years. And the secondary name listed on the lease agreement, the co-signatory, the person legally tied to that address alongside Claire Hendricks, was Daniel Mercer. Frank sat back in his chair and looked at his screen for a long moment. He had been hired to find an affair. He had found something. But he was no longer sure affair was the right word for it. Because affairs were transient, hidden, conducted in hotels and borrowed spaces and careful absences. What the lease told him was different. What the lease told him was that Daniel Mercer had a home on Westbrook Drive and an apartment on Archer Court, and that both of them, in some legal and documented sense, belonged to him. He picked up the phone and made 3 more calls. And what he found over the next 18 hours would change the shape of everything. The marriage certificate was dated June 14, 6 years ago. Frank had found it through a civil records search, the kind of search that sounds complicated but is, in practice, just a matter of knowing which databases to access and having the patience to work through them methodically. He had run Daniel Mercer's name through marriage records across 4 counties, starting with the most likely and working outward, and he had found it on the 3rd county database he checked. It took him 40 minutes. 40 minutes to find the document that unraveled everything. Daniel Edward Mercer and Claire Ann Hendricks. Married June 14, 6 years ago. At a registry office in Claremont County, 30 miles from where Sarah currently slept every night in a house she believed was the foundation of her life. Frank read the certificate twice. Then he checked the divorce records. He checked them thoroughly, not just in Claremont County but across every surrounding jurisdiction, every database he had access to, every filing system that might contain evidence of a legal dissolution. He checked annulment records. He checked legal separation filings. He went back through 6 years of records with the kind of careful, unhurried attention that his years on the force had made second nature. There was nothing. No divorce. No annulment. No legal separation of any kind. The marriage between Daniel Mercer and Claire Hendricks was not a previous marriage that had ended before he met Sarah. It was not a youthful mistake he had legally resolved and quietly moved past. It was a current, active, fully legal marriage. It had been in place for 6 years, and it remained in place right now, at this moment, while Daniel Mercer slept in a house on Westbrook Drive next to a woman named Sarah who believed with every reasonable fiber of her being that she was his wife. She was not his wife. She could not be. Because a person cannot be legally married to 2 people simultaneously. What she was, and this was the part that sat in Frank's chest like something cold and heavy when he finally allowed himself to think it through, what she was, technically and legally, was a victim of fraud. Their marriage certificate, the one Sarah had framed and hung in the hallway of the house on Westbrook Drive, the one she had looked at on the morning of her wedding with the particular overwhelming joy of a person who believes they are beginning the best chapter of their life, that certificate was legally void. It had been void from the moment it was signed. Daniel had known that. He had stood at that registry office and made vows he was not legally permitted to make, to a woman who had no idea he was already bound by identical vows to someone else entirely. Frank pushed back from his desk and stood up and walked to his window and looked at the brick wall outside for a while. He had been doing this job for 29 years and he thought he had encountered most of the variations that human deception was capable of producing. He had found affairs and financial frauds and hidden families and faked deaths and elaborate insurance schemes. He had sat across from clients and delivered information that changed their lives in irreversible ways. He had developed, over 3 decades, a professional detachment that allowed him to do that without being dismantled by it. He was not a cold man, he simply understood that his job was to find the truth, not to carry it on behalf of the people he found it for. But this one sat differently. Maybe it was the pregnancy, he had noticed it at their first meeting, said nothing because it wasn't his business, but noticed it. Maybe it was the cash she'd counted out on his desk for the nursery she was planning. Maybe it was simply the specific, particular cruelty of what Daniel had constructed, not a moment of weakness or a reckless mistake but a deliberate, sustained, architecturally precise deception that he had maintained for 4 years without apparent difficulty or remorse. Frank stood at his window for several minutes. Then he went back to his desk and kept working, because that was the job. What he uncovered over the following 2 days was the machinery of it, the practical infrastructure of how a person maintains 2 complete lives in the same city without either life becoming aware of the other. And it was, Frank had to admit with a kind of grim professional respect, impressively constructed. The schedule was the foundation. Daniel had divided his week with the precision of someone managing 2 separate business accounts. Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays followed a fixed pattern, Archer Court first, then the office. Wednesdays and Fridays he went directly to the office and came home to Westbrook Drive at a normal hour. Every other weekend he told Sarah he was traveling for work, a regional conference, a client site visit, a training weekend. He told Claire the same thing, mirrored exactly. 2 women in the same city, both receiving the same explanation for the same absence, neither with any reason to question it because the explanation was always delivered calmly, consistently, and with just enough specific detail to feel real. The finances were equally deliberate. Daniel had arranged his salary to be split across 2 direct deposit accounts, something he had set up years earlier through a simple payroll adjustment that neither woman had any reason to investigate. The first account was the joint account he shared with Sarah, which covered the mortgage on Westbrook Drive and their household expenses. The second was a personal account in his name only, from which he paid Claire's rent on Archer Court and covered her living expenses, framing it to her, Frank would later learn, as temporary financial support while her freelance business stabilized. Claire believed she was accepting help from a devoted husband going through a difficult financial period at work. She had no idea she was being funded by the operational budget of a double life. And then there was the detail that Frank found buried in his research on the 3rd day, the detail that reframed everything and explained why, after 4 years of apparently seamless management, Daniel Mercer had been growing visibly more distracted, more prone to unexplained lateness, more scattered in the small ways that Sarah had been cataloging without fully realizing she was doing so. Claire Hendricks was pregnant. Frank found it not through records but through Claire's social media, a single post, privacy settings not quite tight enough, a comment from a friend that was just visible enough to confirm it. He cross-referenced it against the timeline of Daniel's increasingly erratic behavior over the past 2 months and it aligned precisely. Claire was approximately 10 weeks along. Sarah, as Frank already knew from her own account, was 12 weeks pregnant. Daniel Mercer had 2 pregnant wives. In the same city. Both carrying children he had presumably fathered, both believing he was their husband, both waiting, in their different ways, across their different lives, for him to step fully into the future they each believed they were building with him. And somewhere in the increasingly narrow gap between those 2 futures, he had been trying to figure out what came next. The distraction Sarah had been sensing for weeks was not guilt. It was mathematics. He was running out of time and he was running out of calendar and he was beginning, for the first time in 4 years, to lose control of the machinery he had built. Frank typed his final report that evening. It ran to 11 pages. He attached the photographs, the lease records, the marriage certificate, the timeline, the financial summary. He read through it once from the beginning to make sure it was complete and accurate and said exactly what the evidence showed, nothing more, nothing less. Then he closed the document, printed 2 copies, and put them in a manila folder. He called Sarah the next morning and asked her to meet him. Neutral ground, he said. He named a coffee shop on the other side of the city from Westbrook Drive, far enough that she wouldn't run into anyone who knew her. He told her to come alone. He told her to take the morning off work if she could. She asked him, her voice very steady in a way that told him it was costing her something to make it sound that way, whether he had found what she thought he'd found. Frank looked at the manila folder on his desk. He thought about how to answer that. And then he told her the truth, not the whole truth, not yet, but enough. What I found, he said carefully, is not what either of us expected. The coffee shop Frank had chosen was quiet at that hour, a small place with wooden tables and windows that fogged slightly at the edges from the cold outside. Sarah was already there when he arrived, sitting in the corner booth he'd suggested, both hands wrapped around a cup she didn't appear to be drinking from. She had dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago when she'd first walked into his office. She looked like someone who had been sleeping the way people sleep when they're bracing for something, lightly, incompletely, one ear always open. Frank sat down across from her and set the manila folder on the table between them. He did not push it toward her right away. He ordered a coffee from the waitress who appeared at his elbow, waited until she left, and then looked at Sarah directly. "Before you open that," he said, "I need you to hear something first. What's in this folder is not what you hired me to find. You came to me because you thought your husband was having an affair. He is not having an affair." He paused for just a moment, long enough for that to land. "What he is doing is considerably more serious than that. And I need you to be prepared for the fact that what you're about to read is going to change the legal reality of your life, not just the personal one." Sarah looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Her hands tightened slightly around her cup. Then she reached out and took the folder. She opened it to the first page. It was the marriage certificate. Her eyes moved across it and Frank watched her face with the careful, quiet attention of someone who has delivered terrible news enough times to know that the first few seconds tell you everything about how a person is built. Sarah did not gasp. She did not make a sound at all. She read the certificate once, all the way through, and then she read it again. And then she set it down on the table with the same slow, deliberate care with which you might set down something you're afraid of breaking, even though it has already broken you. Daniel Edward Mercer and Claire and Hendricks. June 14, 6 years ago, she turned to the next page. Frank had organized the folder so that the evidence built logically, the marriage certificate first, then the lease records showing Daniel's name on Archer Court, then the financial summary, then the photographs, then the timeline laid out in plain language that made the architecture of the last 4 years visible in a way that no single piece of evidence could do alone. Sarah went through it page by page without rushing, without skipping ahead. She read everything. The only sound between them was the low murmur of the coffee shop around them and the occasional turn of a page. When she reached the final page of the report she closed the folder and placed both hands flat on top of it and looked out of the fogged window beside their table. She stayed like that for what felt like a long time. Frank said nothing. He had learned, across 29 years, that silence after a revelation like this was not emptiness, it was a person reorganizing everything they thought they knew about their own life, and that process could not and should not be rushed. Finally, Sarah turned back from the window and looked at him. Her eyes were dry. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and perfectly controlled, and it cost her something enormous to make it so. "Does she know about me?" she asked. Frank shook his head. "She doesn't." Sarah absorbed that. She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected but needed to hear confirmed out loud. Then she looked down at the folder under her hands and she said, almost to herself, "So she's in there too. She's in there the same as me." And that, more than any legal document, more than any photograph or financial record or carefully compiled timeline, was the moment that captured everything about what Daniel Mercer had actually done. He had not simply deceived one woman. He had built 2 entire lives, populated them with 2 real people who had real feelings and real futures and real children growing inside them, and he had managed those lives the way a person manages competing obligations, efficiently, practically, with a focus on keeping both operational rather than any genuine reckoning with the human cost of what he was doing. There was no version of this story in which Daniel was careless or impulsive or overtaken by feeling. This was constructed. This was chosen, repeatedly, every single day for 4 years. Sarah contacted a family law attorney the same afternoon. The legal situation she found herself in was complicated in ways that took several months to fully untangle, but the direction of it was never in doubt. Because Sarah's marriage was legally void from the moment it was performed, Daniel had no legal standing to marry her while his marriage to Claire remained in place. The proceedings were not a divorce but a formal annulment on grounds of fraud. The court, once presented with Frank's report and the supporting documentation, moved with unusual decisiveness. Judges, it turned out, did not look kindly on bigamy. They looked even less kindly on it when the man in question had deceived not one but two pregnant women simultaneously. Daniel was charged with bigamy, which in their state carried the weight of a felony. He was also charged with fraud in connection with the mortgage on the Westbrook Drive property, which had been obtained under false pretenses given that his financial disclosures at the time of application had concealed the existence of his financial obligations to a second household. His attorney attempted to negotiate. The prosecutor was not in a negotiating mood. Sarah kept the house. The court's reasoning was straightforward: she had been defrauded into purchasing it and had contributed equally to its financing. Claire, once the full picture became clear to her, retained her own attorney and pursued her own legal remedies. The two women never met in person. They spoke once, briefly, by phone, about 2 months after everything came out, a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes and that neither of them has ever described publicly in any detail. What is known is that by the end of it they had agreed on one thing, that whatever anger they each carried, none of it belonged to the other. Both women kept their children. Sarah had a girl, born in September, whom she named Eleanor. Claire had a boy, born 7 weeks later. Daniel Mercer was present for neither birth. He was, by that point, navigating the consequences of what he had built, the legal ones, the financial ones, and the permanent, irreversible collapse of the two lives he had believed he could maintain indefinitely. Frank Malone closed the case file on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week he had first sat outside the Callaway Group office building with cold coffee and a camera on his passenger seat. He filed the final paperwork, archived the photographs, and shredded his working notes the way he always did when a case concluded. He did not allow himself to dwell on cases once they were closed. That was another rule he had developed somewhere around year 5, for the same reason as all his other rules, because the job required you to find the truth and deliver it and then let it go, because carrying it was not your function and would eventually make it impossible to do the work. But he thought about Sarah, briefly, before he closed the file. He thought about her sitting in that corner booth with both hands flat on the folder, looking out the fogged window. He thought about the way she had asked her question, not does he love her, not how long, not why, but does she know about me? As though her first instinct, even in the wreckage of everything she had just learned, was to think about the other woman sitting in the same wreckage on the other side of the city that he thought that said something. He wasn't sure exactly what. But something that he closed the file. He put it in the archive drawer. He picked up the next folder on his desk, which belonged to a different client with a different problem, and he got back to work. Daniel Mercer had spent 4 years constructing a lie so thorough and so precisely maintained that he had apparently come to believe it was sustainable. Frank Malone had spent 6 days dismantling it. And what the case left behind, beyond the legal proceedings and the court documents and the archived photographs, was a simpler truth that required no investigation to understand. You can build a life on a foundation of deception. You can maintain it, manage it, schedule it, and fund it. You can do it for months or years or, in some cases, decades. But the foundation is still what it is. And foundations, eventually, always tell the truth about what they are made of. Sometimes all it takes is one person deciding to look. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this one, strange, real, and more unbelievable than anything you could make up, we have an entire playlist ready for you to watch right now. Just click here and it's all there waiting for you. Until next time. See you.